Good evening. We'll begin in just a moment. If everyone could make their way to their seats, please. Awesome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Brittany McGee. I'm the Next Generation Officer at the Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our Young Professionals program, discussing the future of modern journalism in the age of immense digitalization and flailing institutional trust. We're in for a pretty timely discussion tonight, and really happy that you all were able to join us. Most of you know the House rules. I see a few familiar faces in the crowd, but for our guests and newcomers, tonight's program is on the record and being live streamed, so I ask that you please silence your phone, but you can keep them out as we will be taking questions through our online survey technology, the link to which you can find on the screen on either side of me. Simply type chi.cnf.io into your device browser and select tonight's program to submit your question for consideration. As this program is on the news through digital engagement, we very much welcome your online engagement with us, especially on social media, and encourage you to tag #CouncilYP in your posts. As you're tweeting and Facebooking, though, know that views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. We engage not only the nation's and world's top leaders, but also Chicago's next generation of leaders with programming to increase your global fluency and cultural competence. I encourage you, if you're not yet a member with us, to join. You can join tonight and participate in our Young Professionals Network. I promise you it will be a meaningful and valuable experience for you. And to find out a little bit more about the Young Professionals Network or joining as a member of the Council, I invite you to visit one of our Young Professional Ambassadors, Kay. She's in the back of the room. You can do it after the program. Back to tonight's program. What is trustworthy news? Most say that it is news that is accurate, verified, and accountable. Others add that it should be ethically produced. How do we know when all of these things are true? And how has the rise of digital media made it harder to know? How can we course correct? To unpack some of these questions for us and other questions surrounding this issue is our panel of experts. I'm excited to introduce them briefly. Katerina Matsa is an Associate Director of Journalism and Media at the Pew Research Center. She's an expert on journalism and media within the U.S. broadcasting sector and has focused her studies on local television, political polarization, and media habits, and millennial consumption of news. So she's in the right place. She is currently pursuing a doctorate in communications at American University and holds a BA in political science from Pantheon University in Athens, Greece, an MA in politics and government from the London School of Economics, and an MA in communication, culture, and technology from Georgetown University. Colin McMahon is Senior Vice President for Editorial Operations at Tribune Publishing. We're using data and audience research. He works to help legacy newsrooms reimagine, restructure, and redeploy talent. He is reporting, editing, and foreign correspondent postings in Mexico, Buenos Aires, Baghdad, and Moscow. Colin holds a bachelor's from Ohio Wesleyan University. María Ramírez is a reporter, writer, and co-founder of two digital media startups, Politibot and El Español, as well as a current resident fellow at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. Ramírez was a political reporter for Univision and a correspondent for El Mundo in Brussels and New York, where she covered numerous elections in the U.S. and in Europe. She was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and graduated from Universidad CEU San Pablo in Madrid and Columbia Journalism School in New York. Jay Struberg is a television journalist, and I should add that Jay is moderating our panel for this evening, with Newsy and the producer and host of The Briefing. Jay specializes in national and international news and sports, striving to present news in an easily digestible yet informed and objective way. He holds a bachelor's in general studies from Southeast Missouri State University and a certificate of broadcasting arts, TV, and radio from the Broadcast Center of St. Louis. I will return to moderate Q&A, so get your questions percolating, but until then, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. This is a really complex, complicated, and very, very important topic. We were even talking about it back there, and so many subjects that you can just dig and go down a rabbit hole, but hopefully we'll provide some clarity. In just a few weeks, we're all, or most of us, are going to be going to the polls to vote in the November midterm elections. Some are calling it a very pivotal year. We're already being bombarded with messages and information about candidates running for office and incumbents trying to hold on to their seats. And it's raised some big concerns about, is the information we're receiving, is it accurate? And is it being presented in a way that's not biased? Is it being presented in a way that's trying to influence our opinion, more importantly? And tonight we're going to be looking at several key areas. One of them is going to be how we consume news, and another is going to be the spread of misinformation or fake news, which I'm sure you're all well aware of. We'll try to be tackling those problems. How is the internet affecting news consumption? What is being done to stop fake news? Is it all on us? Are we the ones that have to stop it, or do we need to rely on the private sector? Or does the government need to do more? These are really big questions and not an easy answer to. A lot to unpack. But let's begin. I want to turn to the panel right now. Let's begin with just trust in the news media, the digital media, or lack thereof, as with information that we receive. According to Pew, the vast majority of us doubt the information we get from social media, and the trust level for traditional media isn't a whole lot better. Guys, why is distrust in digital news media increasing? Anybody want to tackle it first?
Well, thanks so much.
Since you're with Pew, go ahead.
Yeah. And, you were... Kat,
No, please go ahead.
Kat has all the numbers, the good numbers. My take on this is basically that we are living in a more fragmented world of information now. And there is definitely also the part of the definition of what media is, and also the way you ask the question is very relevant to the data that you get, because media could mean the New York Times, ProPublica, it could mean the Chicago Tribune, but it also could mean Breitbart, anything that you see on social media. So I think part of the problem is also the question and the fact that especially young people are very skeptical about what they see online. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I think probably this generation is just better prepared to just analyze and to understand what's true and what's not true. So I think the level of distrust could also mean that they are looking at the information they get with a more critical eye. So that's not necessarily bad. And I think it also puts pressure on us as journalists to do an effort to make clear that how do we do our job and be transparent about it. And I think we probably also, because we always talk about, the levels of distrust, how worrisome it is, but we probably should see it also as a positive thing that, maybe it's good that there is like a critical generation looking at us. And we need to do more to explain how do we do our job and why some news sources are good and some others are not even news sources.
Yeah, trust, I totally agree with you. This is a complex news environment. The way people are consuming news, the way they're interacting with news has changed dramatically in the past 10, 15 years. And it's not just how they're getting news, which we're going to talk about, this rise of online and digital, but it's also how they're experiencing news, especially younger people. When it comes to trust, there is and you mentioned the numbers, yes, there is a high level, like there is a very low level of trust when it comes to social media. When it comes to news and information that you get from social media, just 5% of the public trusts what they see there. So unpacking that, what does it lead? Like we're hearing all these things about misinformation and fake news. One of the things that we saw in the past year and two is that, yes, there is a level of concern in terms of inaccuracy on social media. And that cuts across all the generations that they are social media users. That's the first thing that tops their mind. When you're asking them what you dislike the most, inaccuracy will be the one big element. I also agree that it's true that a lot of times when we ask the questions of the public of whether you trust or distrust the news media, there are many ways to unpack that and to get to that. Like it could be the institution of the news media, like a very general question. And we've seen it's not only the news media that they're suffering from that low trust, those low trust levels over the years. There is Congress, there are colleges and education. There are many other institutions that they are receiving that kind of same assessment and evaluation from the public. It's not only the news media. However, it is true when you are asking people what specifically they get, whether they turn to get news, their own sources, the ones that they choose to go to, are the ones that they're more likely also to trust. It's not that they distrust the news media holistically. I mean, there is a portion of people that they do, but if you are turning to certain sources and you cite and you say that this is the way you are getting news, also that will translate most likely to higher levels of trust with that specific source.
Colin, do you think distrust in the media has changed a lot over time? Not just dating back to this, I know it grew a lot out of the last election, fake news kind of emerged, but does it go back even further? Do we have too many options right now with news sources?
Yeah, I think that distrust certainly, I mean, you talk to some of the people who have been in the business for, decades and decades, and you think about, these kind of historical figures like Walter Cronkite and stuff like that. And that was this, this trusted person who came into your house every night and told you what was going on, right? But I think the whole kind of 70s, 80s is when you can really see things changing. And I think that they're particularly in the 80s, you start to hear this, the kind of silent majority talk, right? And I think from that, there was this, well, the media will tell you this, but in fact, this is how most Americans believe. So I think that you can trace a lot of it back to that decade.
Let's talk about how we're consuming news, how we're digesting it now. Like I was saying, there's a lot of different choices now. I mean, we can go TV, old school print if we want to go that route. Obviously online, smartphones, smart speakers, carrier pigeon. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Kat, can you break down some numbers for us? I know you're a numbers person.
Yes.
Think of you.
We don't have the last option. We don't ask about that, but we ask of all the others. Yes, I mean, one thing that it's not surprising is that digital and online is a core pathway for people today to get news, especially among younger people. That's the one, and however you want to ask about that, whether it's a way of platform or it's a way of what is your main source, like in an open-ended question, social media, online sources, or online ways of getting news is the main pathway. Interestingly, it's not just the young people that they are also, like, we are seeing this kind of trend. Especially last year, we saw that the social media news consumption, for instance, is something that it's rising among older people or demographics that in the past did not turn to social media for news, like non-whites or people with lower levels of education.
Just for clarity here, when you say social media news consumption, this is finding news articles on social media through Twitter and clicking them, like through those social media
That's
means,
a
right?
great point.
Or not clicking them, as the case may be.
Yes, that could also be the case, just scanning. So it's interesting. So there are a bunch of ways to get to that. One would be the straight way that we usually ask people that, like, do you actually get news from Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, all these different platforms? And many will have, some concerns about this where, well, of course they're going to say, yes, they're on these platforms and of course they are getting news, but the news that they are getting is outcomes and content that news organizations are putting on there. However, very interestingly, and that's a kind of an older study that we did in 2015, which was a deep dive in media habits among generations. When you ask millennials, for instance, which is, back then it was the 18 to 34-year-olds, so now I guess they're like 36 or 37. When you ask them what do they consider their main source for political news, and you don't prompt them about anything, Facebook was the top source. That's what tops their mind. That's what they're thinking as the place, the environment that they will get news. So many times when we're thinking and unpacking that, we are thinking it as journalists or as news organizations that this is the content that is on these spaces, but that's not necessarily how the public thinks about this or how they're interacting with news.
So how is the internet and social media, for that matter, how is it different now than it was, say, let's just veer back before the 2016 election. Do you guys see it becoming more of an issue now with the so many news choices, with fake news on social media? What do you guys think?
Well, I think that definitely is more an issue because there are more people in these platforms to begin with. And also the kind of conversation that we have seen, so polarized, so aggressive, is obviously a point, especially in the US, but not just in the US. In Europe, we have seen also a similar trend. So I think that's why also it increases our perception of the problem. I think at least we are more informed about disinformation, misinformation. We as journalists are more aware, more active about that, and also readers. I think they are more, they have more data about what's happening, and that's probably the good part about it. But I think that, something has changed in the last 2 years, definitely.
Are we more aware of it now, more aware of fake news? It wasn't even a thing until the 2016 election when you started seeing articles like Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump, something that is demonstrably false that is, and that's kind of where it rose up. Do you think, are there numbers to back up that we can distinguish the two?
Well, there are like 12 big projects now working on misinformation, disinformation. So obviously there is a lot of investment on this, on fighting this. So I think that in the end, that transpires also to the reader, to the audience, to the public. And what we see, and probably Kat could help us with the data, it's that probably the people in this room, the young people, are better equipped to identify false information, that probably the younger people wouldn't share the story of Pope endorses Donald Trump, right. I suspect. But in general, I think it's good that we're having this debate, and that there is also the new awareness of even the expression fake news is an expression that political leaders around the world, not just in the US, are using to define just information they don't like. And I think that little by little also that distinction is being done, like falsehoods and just uncomfortable information that politicians don't want out there.
Yeah, so I think that skepticism that you talked about, I agree that that's on the rise, no question. People are more aware of it. And it's well-earned, no doubt. The skepticism is well-earned. I think the danger is when this skepticism turns into, well, I'm only going to trust this source, right, to the exclusion of any other sources. And when I say source, I don't mean platform, I mean source. And then I think there's this cynicism, right? When skepticism turns into cynicism and it's like, well, they're all the same, right? Can't trust any of them. Then I think that's a real danger. So I think and you would be able to correct me on this, I think there's an age difference, like that. I think that skepticism can turn into cynicism with the young people who have a distrust for all authority. And then the older people might say, well, I'm only going to trust X source, whether that's Fox News or CNN or anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It's again, we're going back to this complex phenomenon, which is not just misinformation and inaccuracy, polarization. That's one of the big issues that is not a new thing. I mean, there's a bunch of academic research that they've done on elite polarization, which is kind of like what the political level polarization that has been happening and has been documented by academics now for 20, 30 years. There is polarization in the American public at the same time. We've studied the past 15 years, kind of like this growing gap between Democrats and Republicans in terms of where, their values, where they stand on issues and all that. Taking that to the media is where you see big divides between Republicans and Democrats, or conservatives and liberals. And it comes to things like the content that you're exposed to, the news that you are exposed to, the sources that you turn to, the specific news organizations, and your attitudes towards the media. And it's more than even age. That's what is driving a lot of these kind of views, where, for instance, a common role of the news media, the watchdog role, where, news organizations criticizing and keeping an eye on political leaders. That specific question, we've been tracking it since 1985. Last year and this year, it's the biggest divide we've seen between Republicans and Democrats on this specific issue. And that's just one small example. If you're asking, for instance, Trump voters and Clinton voters where they got their 2016 election news, they will volunteer much different choices that they went. Like Trump voters concentrated around Fox News. That's their primary way of getting news, while Clinton voters had a much more diverse or longer list of different outlets, that there wasn't one outlet and news organization that was popping up. And these are just some examples of how basically these two groups in American society are living in very, very different media environments.
María, do you see this? You spent a lot of time in Spain.
Yeah, I'm from Spain.
Who doesn't? Do you see this anywhere in Europe, maybe, or is this kind of an exclusive thing to the U.S., this polarization, this tribal culture? Are we seeing this in Europe as well?
Yeah, it's definitely happening in Europe, and we saw it in Brexit too. Actually, in 2016, I covered both Brexit and the Trump election, so I was first row to this. And not just in those cases, but also in Spain, definitely. We see a similar sort of conversation, very extreme, very against the facts. In the case of the referendum in Catalonia, on independence in Catalonia, this region in the north of Spain. And we see also similar phenomenon around elections, around the French elections. We're seeing it now in Italy, which is turning very complicated, in a very complicated place, actually. And so it's really, although I think the phenomenon in America is more complex, because there is race, there is history, there is a lot of specificities about the US, but we are definitely seeing the same kind of phenomenon, and distrust in media in Europe is really similar. And also a big age gap. That's also a dynamic we're seeing there.
Not to veer too much off topic, could it also, there's obviously a lot of factors that come into it, but just the rejection of establishment politics. You mentioned Emmanuel Macron, French president, that election. He was a complete political outsider with relatively no experience, had a short economic background, but really had no political experience, and he got ushered into office. And kind of that same uprising, similar to Trump, that outsider appeal. Do you guys think that has an impact as well, populism?
Well, yeah, although the case of Macron, I think, is the case of, well, one people from outside or more or less outside the establishment who gets there, but actually is a moderate in policy, in politics. So that's the case of where he sort of used the wave of the outsider or the image of the outsider and just won the election, but didn't exactly grow in the same way or with the same promise to destroy the government or the big institutions as it happened in other places. So,
but I think your center point that the news media is caught up in this rejection of institutional standards and institutions as a whole, I think is wholly accurate, sure.
And it's definitely in Europe. Like, we did actually a big deep dive into 8 European countries. This last May, we put out this big report, and it was touching on populism. And the populism with the elements of anti-elitism in there. And what we saw is actually when it comes to attitudes towards the media, populism was the defining driver of those differences. It wasn't even left-right ideology that, it's what we are seeing mainly in the US, that basically those that they hold these kind of views are less trusting of the news media. They don't think the media are doing a good job in reporting the news fairly or even covering the news, the important stories of the day, like all these key functions that the media are doing. Those that they hold these populist views are much more negative towards the news media. And that was across all the 8 countries that we studied.
Let's talk about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. What are these companies doing? Are they doing enough? Do they need to do more as far as combating the fake news, the disinformation that we see online? I know today Facebook just had another purge of hundreds of pages and accounts for coordinated inauthentic behavior, whatever you want to call it. But it seems like it's geared towards fake news of some nature. Do you think they're doing enough here?
So I think Facebook and obviously Google, the whole economics of it are well known. That's siphoned off all the advertising revenue and located on those platforms, and yet the content that's kind of fueling the use of those platforms is often traditional news media that isn't getting those ad dollars anymore. So I think there's a real problem there. I think Facebook is willfully ignoring the problem. I think that Facebook is Facebook will put out a press release about a $250,000 program to help the news media. So $250,000, Facebook. And I think Google's a little bit more active because Google, I think, understands that really search and media is just critical to their platform. So I would say from the economic standpoint, they're not doing enough. And I also have some views on whether they're doing enough to combat fake news, but I'll not talk about that right now.
Oh, please do.
Well, I would just say this is a very global audience. People understand that Facebook wants to pretend that the world is the same, and so that they have to have a global standard for who is respectable and who isn't. But if you ask Facebook, well, do you go into Bulgaria and just treat everybody the same, including state-sponsored media? They'll say, no, of course not, because we know that that's not a credible source. And yet here in the United States, they'll say, well, we can't put a finger on the scale because we don't know who's a credible source and who isn't. And so I think that there's some gaps in Facebook's explanations for why they don't do some more here in the United States to enforce what are clearly sources that are not reputable.
This seems like almost a rhetorical question, but what's the ultimate danger to democracy with the spread of misinformation? Living in I can't believe I'm asking this, a post-truth society that I've heard so much, it almost makes me cringe every time I say it, like that's even in question. The fact that I even have to ask that question troubles me, that's even been asked. What are your thoughts?
Well, one of the aspects common in all dictatorships is the lack of truth. In Orwell's book, the Ministry of Truth was one of the bases of the regime. So a ministry where you go and you fabricate facts, and that's the alternative reality. Well, we need independent sources as watchdogs, and if we don't have facts and people who are actually devoted to just looking for facts, then we are lost, because there is no one with no interest other than just seeking the truth to just check on governments, on your local government, on the big companies, on the small companies. So it's really important to have those news outlets that are actually the ones whose ultimate goal is just to find the truth. Because, yeah, there could be other kinds of groups and even political parties sometimes in their opposition could just get information out, but they have other interests and other goals. Right. So to have someone from the outside watching what's true or trying to find out the truth is just the basis of any democracy.
Outside of journalists, who obviously our job is seeking the truth and reporting the truth, there's a fine line of, do you get government or business involved? And is there a point, if you do choose to get government involved, say, to suppress something that is fake, are you suppressing free speech?
Yeah.
And does it lead to more authoritarian principles?
Yeah, and there's definitely a difference between Europe and the US. And in Europe, there's already been interventions, even with Google, the right to be forgotten. So it's basically the right of people to erase information from Google, or try to. And there is some regulation already on these platforms, and a debate about regulate more about the content. And we have laws in some countries in Europe, as Germany, where clearly you can say whatever you want. It's very different from America, where freedom of speech and First Amendment obviously is like a high priority in society. And I think although there is a point to be made to regulate these platforms in terms of privacy and data, probably try to regulate the content from the government is not a good idea, because where's the line?
Definitely the public is not in favor of the government stepping in. This exact question is something we were really interested this past spring of, like, what is this balance and relationship between, the First Amendment and misinformation online? How do people feel about this? And when it comes to government, more Americans, a majority, believes that the government shouldn't step in, that freedom of information should be preserved and maintained, even if that means that misinformation or false information might occur online. However, where things alter and they flip is when it comes to tech companies. That's where the public is more open, and they're more likely to encourage and support tech companies taking steps to combat false information online. And it speaks exactly to that. There are major differences between Europe and the US when it comes to freedom of expression and information. The US always, the public is more supportive of different elements of that scale when it comes to, like, freedom of expression, but even like protests and the right to, say things that they are offensive to religious groups and all that. The US always is, the public is more supportive than Europe or the global, like other countries, basically. So there is this element of very strong culture here that it is driven by the Constitution to support that kind of freedom when it comes to government.
I think the thing we saw yesterday, though, it frays a little bit on party level now, right?
Yes, it does. Like, Democrats are more likely to be supportive of those kind of interventions, for sure. But it's not that huge, like, of a divide, which is interesting. I mean, as a researcher, when I saw the data, I was like, it's one of these things that It's not this huge thing pulling those two groups away, but it's definitely, there is a difference to that.
I know there's been some moves. This all reminded me of the social media sites, tech giants, how they took action against Alex Jones of InfoWars. And it was unrelated to because he often peddles conspiracy theories on his shows, and they kicked him off, I think apparently because he had said in the video that he was encouraged people to take up arms or something, and it violated their rules. Do you think that, and they banned him from the sites, Instagram, Apple, all the tech giants. Do you think that they overall, though, have given a platform even to bad ideas? Well, have they done that well? And is that okay for them to do that?
Well, there is this debate, right, about they are private companies, so they can set the rules. They are not, it's not the government, it's not a public sphere that you have to really just let everybody talk. But at the same time, they're so big that it's the equivalent sort of the public square in the new digital world. So it's a complicated balance because although it's true that they can impose the rules and they are a private company and they decide what kind of conversation they want there, they are so big and so global that is the equivalent of the public square. So even in legal terms, if some of those cases would reach the Supreme Court, it would be interesting to see how they are defined, because that could change a lot about what can they do and what they can do. But in terms of maybe just doing something more practical, I think you don't have to censor or to kick out people or to erase accounts to do something about it. One of the things that Facebook could do, for instance, is to be more transparent about the content that is posted. Like they could give you information about when the website was created, because sometimes these automatic bots or automatic website, they were just created. So that maybe it's a sign that something is wrong with that, or just give you more metadata about the video, when it was shot, who did it. So just being more transparent about what's out there and just let the user decide if it's maybe a trustworthy source or not. That would be helpful, and that's easy for them.
Let's talk. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was about to say it is true that one of the things we did this very we call it a diary survey. I know it sounds weird, but basically the goal was to actually ping people twice a day to kind of get their habits in terms of online news consumption. It was very interesting that when people got their news from social media, it was the level or the times that they could recall the source, the brand, dropped dramatically from when, for instance, they were getting an alert or directly from a news organization, that content. And it speaks to that disconnect. Sure. Like when you are in that environment, that social environment, that you might not even be looking for news. You might just be there to check pictures of your friends and family and all that, and you just bump into something that it's in your feed. The level of the relationship with that journalist or news organization, it's not there as it is if I was subscribed or I was getting these news alerts directly and having that kind of relationship.
And I think that helps explain some of the tugging away of credibility, right? Because you're getting so many sources. I mean, if you think about your own lives, think about the last time, 10 years ago, you might have said, I saw this in the Times the other day, right? And now you'll say, yeah, I saw this, I don't know where I saw it, right? And it could very well have been the Times or some other reputable organization, but because you are sourcing so many places that you kind of lose track of where you even read things, right? So I think that's a large part of it. I think the other thing about Facebook kind of offering this, or anybody, right, Twitter, offering this town square to talk about things, that we have all this idealistic thing that if the truth will out, right, that somebody's going to come up and disprove this person, and then rational minds will say, well, that's obviously not true. And yet we know that debunking actually supports the original lie. and that there's more evidence that repeating the lie, even while you're debunking it, gets more people to believe it. And so that's a frustrating thing.
Confirmation
Puts us in
bias.
really a pickle. Do you call out the fact there, I mean the falsehood, or do you leave it be?
The whole fact-checking thing is a very complex initiative, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on a little bit. I want to talk about innovations in the industry, particularly a really kind of controversial one, robojournalism. We were talking about this earlier, Maria. Could you kind of just explain for somebody who doesn't know what robojournalism is? It's pretty self-explanatory, but kind of just explain the whole thing.
Yeah, well, basically when we use this expression, it's referred to automatically generated text or automatically generated content. The AP, for instance, did some experiments, and this has been going on for a while, since 2013, like for news on sports or financial news about the markets. So something usually with numbers that a machine could put together quickly and usually better than a human because it's numbers. And there have been some other experiments, like the Washington Post did something similar with the results in the Olympics in 2016, and there's similar things. But I think it could help in these stories that have really no particular value, that are being done or not by a human. But it's very difficult to imagine that this could substitute it in any meaningful way a scoop from a newspaper, a feature, something like the big stories that we actually remember and that we actually value in journalism. I don't see how a robot, even when the natural language is better developed than now, could substitute. And it could refer to many things because it's also about chatbots. And well, I'm part of this team called Politibot of a chatbot. And that's a conversation on Facebook Messenger, but there is actually a human being doing the conversation behind the chatbot. If you put some keywords in it, you could receive information related to that, links or pictures or other information related to the topic, but the basic information is done by a human being. And I think it's like automatic tools are useful, are definitely something that could be in support of the work that we do, but I don't see how they are going to be a substitute ever of reporting.
Can I get one more in? Let's end on this one, because I know she stood up there and she's like, stop talking. Let's wrap it up here with just solutions. How do we combat this? Is it all on the journalists? Is it on the business? Is it on the government? What's the best approach that we can do to break down misinformation and to get the truth out, to make sure that it prospers?
Well, I definitely think that transparency is something that we could all try. It's a very complex issue, so it's journalists, it's governments maybe a bit, it's the platforms, it's the readers. But one common thing that I think is useful is transparency. We journalists should talk more about our way of working and give more explanation as far as we can of the fact-checking process, of the sourcing, and the way we work, and also the platforms put more information there about the pieces of information that we find and that could be useful.
I agree, and I also think we need to be transparent about our biases, and I question the whole, not objective journalism, but that's come under fire. I think we need to say, well, here's where I stand on these things, and here's the facts I found. And I think that instead of just saying, I don't pay attention to anything else, I don't see race. I don't pay attention to anything else. I don't see political, I just do this. I think that that's not true.
We're not robots.
We're not robots.
Any final thoughts before we head to question session?
No, I mean, I know that you're waiting. We can, yeah.
So thank you, guys. We are going to speed through a few questions here. There are a number of questions online, and we might have time for a few in the room. Should we take questions in the room, there are council folks across the room with microphones. I just ask that you ask one question, an efficient question that has a question mark at the end. That's our motto here. But we'll start online on our digital platform and in accordance with the theme here. And this is actually our most popular question. The last question was sort of a solutions-oriented question. What should journalists, business, or governments do? And this, a lot of folks in the audience seem to be wondering about the consumer. And so the question is there any study or evidence to show that mistrust in the media, and that is in quotes, is used as an acceptable substitute of apathy or laziness? Are we just too lazy to find out the sources here?
I don't know if we're too lazy. I haven't seen anything that would speak to that. What we've seen, and this is I'm going to try to keep it short, because of course it's like there's so many ways you could go with this. But there is, if you're thinking about what has happened in the past 15 years, digital and technology is one that has not only transformed the way people, as I've said, interact with news, but also the business model that we touched a bit upon. Like the way news organizations are producing, are covering the news has changed, and it has affected also jobs, newsroom jobs, and that has affected also the content. If you're thinking about, let's say, like we looked into State House reporting. It's one of the beats and the professions that has really declined. So that's one. There is a level of, and we haven't done much studying on this, in terms of like what we call fatigue of news, or the overwhelmed, like how much people are fed up, basically, with all this coverage and all that. And we just asked this question, I think it was a year or maybe less than a year. I don't remember exactly when we did this. But basically, yes, there is a large share of the population that feels that they're done. They're like, there's too much news, they're too much exposed. So I'm not sure whether that could even speak to apathy or laziness. There's a lot of people that they follow and they look for news. And especially the other element is like when you're thinking about news, it's not one thing and news and information. For instance, think about local news, which is something that we haven't talked about a lot today. But local news it's a very critical and big component of people's everyday life. And that's the one that constantly, no matter whether it's an election or not, comes up and people are very much interested and they closely follow because it impacts their lives. I mean, it's their everyday life that they're going to go and seek and get information that has to do with their neighborhoods, with their city. So I'm not sure, like, I don't have specific elements in terms of like laziness, but definitely there is a fatigue right now that people are experiencing.
Yeah, and can I just jump on that? I think that breaks down people's willpower, right? And it breaks down people's ability to kind of dig in and see, is this really true? Because it supports what I'm feeling, so I like it, right? So, but is it really true? And then that instant gratification of, I'm going to share this, whether or not I really found out it's true. I think laziness might be too strong a word.
Yeah.
But I think those two things are at work.
Any in the room questions? Oh, quite a few. Yeah. We'll start right on the right side in the back.
I don't know if you're willing to answer this question, but since you are experts in defining credible news, are you willing to share what your favorite news sources are and what you find the most credible for those?
Newsy is great. I've heard. Chicago Tribune is also great.
Yeah, I usually don't. Yeah, this is
Pew research.
Yeah, it will be pew research. Yeah, I usually don't take any personal stance on, issues like that in terms of like what it would be credible or not. I think our mission at the center is more to provide information that people can use and data that people can use to make decisions and value democracy. But I don't have a personal stance.
I think
on
it's
that.
a good idea to have a healthy diet of news, different types of news. Using Google News helps to kind of just spread out and open your options, whether you want to be Politico, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Fox News, CNN. If you want to just grab them all, and if there's going down a narrative that you don't like, then maybe it's time to check it against somebody else. There are times whenever I see that, I'm not going to name any specifically, but I'll see a narrative that's being followed on one site, and I'll go, you know what? I don't know that I buy into all that, so I'm going to look at another one. But I think having a healthy selection, some choices, I think that's the best way to consume news.
Blue shirts right here on the right, in the back.
My question was not to put the Tribune guy on the spot, but about Sinclair Media, about your question about transparency. How do they give the impression that they're local news, but there's kind of an editorial control from a more centralized leadership location? How do we kind of come up with a transparent way of making people realize that there's some editorial control and it's not just local news?
Yeah, I'd love that you asked that question because it allows me to do my 45-second. Okay, so Tribune Publishing, which owns the newspapers, is a separate company from Tribune Media, which owns the broadcast stations. And Sinclair was trying to buy Tribune Media, which is the broadcast stations, not Tribune Publishing, which is the newspapers. So if you have trouble remembering rich guys, normal guys over here, right? But your question is an excellent question, and I think I think Sinclair is a perfect example of the let's say the likelihood that a company that is trying to present a message to as many people in the country as possible, the likelihood that given enough people, given enough outlets, they will turn to those measures. So I do think it's a poster child for whether or not you agree with the message or not. It's a poster child for the danger of having too much control of outlets in one company.
In the front, on the right. Plaid shirt. Oh, plaid right there, yep.
Fight.
Thank you. How would you say that the so-called mainstream media should fight back against sources like Breitbart?
Well, I don't think exactly it's probably the role to fight back, but if they spread false information, probably it's a good idea to just report on that if it's big news. But also I think that it's probably important for mainstream media, or as Margaret Sullivan from the Washington Post call it, fact-based media, is just to distinguish the work that journalists do from more partisan outlets that it's not necessarily a news outlet. And I think although we can see outlets with different editorial lines and editorial inclinations, the main thing that we should look at is the reporting. So is the reporting done with sources, with the process of fact-checking, with actually no agenda from the reporters to try to push something, at least to the best of our knowledge, to the limit of the humanity. And I think it's important to make a difference between partisan websites and news outlets, whatever editorial line would they have.
So we've talked about apathy and fatigue. This is interesting. The question coming from online is, and I'll sort of extend it a little bit, to what degree or level has anti-intellectualism fed into potential distrust in media and a news information gap? And perhaps before answering that, maybe talk about whether or not there is a wave, or from your perspective, there is a wave of anti-intellectualism in the US context.
Wow, that's definitely a difficult question. And also, as I'm thinking about it, we don't have anything specific, but as I'm like thinking about it, it's also like a definitional issue, like intellectualism, like we're meaning about elites or
Universities.
yeah, universities and education and the higher ed and all that. I cannot speak in terms of like, apart from like what I mentioned earlier, that we've seen similar patterns of negative views and effects that are towards Congress and colleges is one, and the news media. But again, I might go back actually to Europe, which I know it is a specific US question, but that's what we saw a lot with this kind of like anti-elitism element of populism, where people are having all this very much negative aspect in terms of like their news media a lot, like they're very, very different, these people, than the rest. But I think it's a great question and definitely something to look into it.
Yeah, and I think it's, it's not just, it's kind of this degrading of skills, right? And I don't mean people's skills are degrading, but people are put less stock in professionalism and put less stock in people's skills and training. And I think it's even in moving beyond academia and the professions. I think even there's less appreciation for craftsmanship, right? And I think it's all part of this. I don't know what it is, but it's all part of this. Anybody could do that, and everybody's opinion is equal. And I think it's a phenomenon that I don't know, I can't put my finger on it, but I don't think it's limited to the media. I think it's in all walks of life.
Yeah, definitely we've seen that in science. And I'm not in our science, we have a science research group, but it is one of the things that we see, that scientists and the public, when it comes to core questions like vaccines, for instance, which I know it's a huge issue, is where they're so different in terms of like their views and all that. So definitely I agree, there's all these different elements in society that they are attracting this kind of attitude.
Front right green turtleneck. She's right here.
So you discussed that younger demographics are more quick to spot fake news, yet they are, well, one, they are the people that are voting at like less rates than maybe middle-aged people or people that are 50 or 60. So how does that impact elections? Or how does that impact, since as an 18-year-old, like I'm not raising a child, but someone who's 35 or 40 is probably raising a child. So if they're passing down false information to those children, how does that impact like future generations?
So that's not a new phenomenon. The unengagement, I don't even know if that's a word, sorry. The lack of engagement, that's a better one. The lack of engagement by younger people in civics or even actually following news, it's not new. That's something that generationally, younger people, even the Gen Xers or the baby boomers, when they were young, there's a lot of research that has shown that they tend to be less engaged. And that is not even a unique characteristic of the young. When you are asking people the basic questions of civic engagement, like did you volunteer, did you donate into a campaign and all that, all those types of questions, the ones that they're more likely to do so are the ones that they are in the ends of the spectrum. So it's not even so much, there is an age component there, but there is a partisan component in there. So the people that they are the more consistently liberals or conservatives, the ones that they feel strongly about issues, they're the ones that they're going to be part of the process, and they're more likely to vote. They're more likely to volunteer and do these types of functions in society. So, in a sense, I would say the young element of that, it's not that surprising because it is more of an age element, not a generation. It's not like that suddenly millennials are so different and they're so uninterested and they don't want to be part of this society compared with like the youngsters in the 90s and the 80s. And there was that kind of element there too.
Hey, so our speakers will stick around for just a little bit more if you hadn't had an opportunity to have your answered question. But I want to ask one last question, 10-second answer to each of you. It's sort of an up and down, but twofold, a predictive question here. Do you think that trust in the media will rebound? Yes or no? And how long will it take? We'll start with Jay.
Okay.
I am an internal optimist, so I'm going to say the truth will survive. I think that there is a big enough thirst for it.
When?
When? 20 years. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Hopefully my lifetime, so.
I'm glad you went first. Yeah, it's very tough. Like, I also hate this kind of like prediction, like, because then if you fail and it's not happening, then they're going to come back to you. So you said in 20 years, it hasn't happened. I would say that I can't say yes or no. I'm struggling here, but it is a very, again, complex phenomenon, and we can't just expect that something will change from one day or another. And if you're thinking even like with Facebook and all these social media platforms, they haven't been around for a long time. Like, even TV, the way we're thinking about it, it's been, around for a while, and still we're learning, and it's now, it is the dominant force in news. So I think we'll have to stick around a bit to see how this will play out and what kind of developments are going to take place.
I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Wow, optimistic.
Yeah, it's been real.
I think it's rebounding already a little bit compared to 1 year ago. And I think it's going to rebound, and probably it's going to help with another person is in the White House.
With that said, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel.